a young woman who was a licensed nurse, who was arrested along with her family members on a road trip through East Texas. She had a very good, successful career with some large hospitals in the Houston area, and found herself named with her co-defendants in an indictment with multiple counts alleging healthcare fraud and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. Vicki at the time was in her early 20s, working as a registered nurse. That was her primary source of income. That was her career. Helping her parents with their home health care business was just something that she did on the side to help them in their treatment of patients in the home health care. It was in the course of their work through the home health company that Vicki got encapsulated in an incredibly frightening experience of being indicted and charged with healthcare fraud. Anytime any employee of any healthcare company finds out that there's some investigation into some wrongdoing, it's important that an individual at least talk with someone like me who's experienced in defending healthcare fraud cases in federal court. By getting involved in investigations early on, we can essentially nip things in the bud. She had absolutely no idea that her parents' business had been under investigation, that there was massive amounts of fraud that was being reported to collect funds through Medicare and through Medicaid. And we soon learned a number of forms that were filed with the Department of Health and Human Services representing that individuals were in need of home health services. A number of these documents represented that Vicki had reviewed their cases and had determined that they needed home health services when in reality there was no need for those services whatsoever. While Vicki had provided some treatment to some individuals, we noticed a trend. We noticed that a number of these patients of her parents' home health care company were people that she had never interacted with, that she had no recollection of ever dealing with. And so when we saw these documents and we saw this evidence and we saw these forms with her names on it and with her signatures on it, we began to suspect and question what was going on. Her and I took a closer look and realized that essentially what was happening was her parents were using her name and using her login and identifiers to fill out these fraudulent forms that purported to say that clients needed home health services when in fact they didn't. There was fear, but there was a lot of shock because there was so much that she didn't know that was going on with her parents and her parents' business. And I had to help her overcome that and let her know that, look, we're gonna get to the bottom of this. We're gonna figure out a way to show that you are absolutely innocent, and we're gonna figure out a way to prove the prosecutors that they do not need to move forward with these charges against you. We had to assume a very high burden of proving to the government prosecutors that they had it wrong, that she had no involvement in any fraudulent activity that her parents, who ultimately pleaded guilty, were in fact guilty of. In this particular case, like with most federal criminal cases, when the prosecutors brought the charges against Vicki, they were firmly of the belief that she was just as involved in the fraudulent activity that her parents were. Even though an individual is presumed innocent, whether they're charged with a state or a federal offense, when a person is charged federally, there is an understated presumption of guilt to a certain degree. And having been a prosecutor, I learned how to evaluate evidence and ask myself, look, what is a jury going to do with this at the end of the day? Am I confident that a jury is going to be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? In a defense attorney capacity, what I'm trying to do is look at what evidence is available, but then look at my evidence in that context. We knew that we had to overcome that presumption of guilt, that we essentially had to assume a burden of proving her innocence beyond a reasonable doubt to the prosecutors in order to convince them that they got it wrong and they needed to dismiss the case against her. It really is essential to get an attorney involved as quickly as possible once an individual knows that they are subject of a federal investigation, so that we can get the jump on evidence that we need to prove that a client is actually innocent, to gather up records and witnesses that can support some of the representations that we're trying to make to the government to show that a client is innocent. We went to the prosecutors, we showed them evidence from experts that her signature had been forged on documents. We showed them evidence that she was working at her normal job at a hospital when patients were allegedly being seen, essentially establishing an alibi for a number of the fraudulent representations and forms submitted. And ultimately, we sat down with prosecutors and let them hear from her so that they could really sense that she was innocent and really get the sense that the case was not as easy to win as they had thought it was when they initially filed the case. That's when we came to what's called a pretrial diversion agreement that ultimately led to the dismissal of the charges against her.